The moderator for our next panel is Lori Lightfoot, and as I mentioned earlier, even a quick overview of Lori's career accomplishments would take an hour. So, just in broad strokes, she's a partner at Mayer Brown here in Chicago, and she serves at the appointment of Mayor Rahm Emanuel as the president of the Chicago Police Board. Previously, Lori was an assistant U.S. attorney. She served as Chicago's interim first deputy procurement officer, general counsel, and chief of staff for the Office of Emergency Management and Communications, chief administrator of the Office of Professional Standards for the Chicago Police Department, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The bottom line is that Lori Lightfoot knows everyone, and everybody that knows Lori respects her. And my biggest coup in putting together this summit was convincing Lori to be on our committee and helping us with planning and getting all of the incredible people that we've had. Because without her, who knows what we'd be doing right now. Ladies and gentlemen, to conduct our panel discussion on the effect of media and social media on Chicago violence, welcome Lori Lightfoot.
Thank you, Dan. Very, very kind and much appreciated. This issue that we've been talking about today clearly is one that captures all of our imaginations. And as speaker after speaker has said, it's one that has to motivate all of us to solve the problems and the challenges that our city faces. We need everybody in this room times 10. So I appreciate your dedication and all of you being here, and I particularly appreciate our panelists for our next discussion. We're going to talk about social media and social networking and how both of those concepts move and drive violence and what can be done using those tools to combat violence. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go through the full bios of all of our panelists. You have them in your handout, but let me just do a quick round of introductions. We're very pleased to have our incredible public defender, Amy Campanella, who's really doing great work on behalf of indigent defendants in Cook County. To her left, we have Jeffrey Jones, who's a special agent with the FBI, who is using the tools of social media to help advance cases and really drive our protection at the federal level with the FBI. We have Chris Millette, who I call Coach because on any given fall Saturday morning, he's pushing third graders around to help them learn about how to work with each other and skills in flag football. But Chris has really been involved in the trenches, is one of the unsung heroes across our city for many, many years, working on issues of trying to identify both the shooters and potential shooters and working with them to try to turn them around, and if not, being a partner with local communities and law enforcement. And he'll tell you a little bit more about work he's been doing on behalf of John Jay. We have, to Chris's left, Kristen McQuarrie, who's a reporter and a member of the Tribune editorial board. You all know that the Tribune has really been a leader in speaking out about the violence that's been happening in our city. And last but not least, I can't do justice to Dr. Andrew Papachristou, but you already heard his publicist, Dr. Serpis. But Andrew is somebody who spent a lot of time in Chicago with the University of Chicago looking at data and analyzing and helping support the efforts of law enforcement here in the city. He's now taken his talents to Yale, but continues to be somebody who looks at Chicago and is working very hard to help us address and solve some of these issues. So why are we focused on social media and social networks? Well, they have transformed the way in which crime is acted out, the tools that are necessary for law enforcement to address it. And as we'll hear, we now are in an era where crimes are actually happening real time on social media platforms. We need to understand the incredible force that social media has become, both in law enforcement and also in the communities where crimes are happening. And we also need to understand how we make these interconnections in social networks, and our panel will help us explore that. To lay the groundwork on the impact of social media generally, I'm going to ask Special Agent Jeff Jones to talk to us a little bit about the expansion of social media platforms, the speed at which information now disseminates across social media platforms, and the number of people who are primarily get their news and information and share important issues of the day through social media. Special Agent Joe?
Yes,
Thank
good
you.
afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Lori.
Speak directly into the microphone.
Sure. Yeah, is this better? Okay, excellent. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I was thinking about the changes in social media and the way it has redefined our communication, and I went back to the dark ages of 1997. And if you were here in America connecting to the World Wide Web, there was a better than 50% chance that you were connecting through America Online. Anyone still remember those discs you used to get all the time? Yeah. I still have some coasters for those. And so what you saw from 1997 was this change where the internet was provided to you in sections. Those of you who used to connect with AOL, you saw that you sign in and there was gossip, there was sports, and everything was really defined and categorized for you. Fast forward just a little while longer after that, and you saw how the internet started to expand, and people wanted to have their own blogs, their own pages, their own space. So MySpace in 2006 was not just the most popular social network, it was the most popular place on the internet, bigger than Google. And now, I don't think anyone here wants to admit they still have a MySpace page. And so from MySpace in 2006, of course, Facebook became the place, and I think it is still the most popular place. More than 1 billion unique logins every single day on Facebook. But the trend is still kind of this communication now to specific people, or person to person, or person to groups. So people are going to mobile apps. They're going to encrypted apps, and we'll talk about that in this post-Snowden era, where people want to share their information with defined groups of persons rather than their 4,995 friends on Facebook. Now they want to share, because we're addicted to it, by the way, they want to talk about where we are, what we're eating, what we're doing, and everything to specific groups of persons. And then in some cases, they want to make sure that they can keep law enforcement outside of their communications. So we've seen that kind of change in the way that communication has been redefined. And I was also thinking back to 2012, on the eve of his re-inauguration, President Barack Obama, you might have seen this, didn't call together his press pool. He issued, or issue a memo. He went to Twitter and posted a picture of himself hugging the First Lady with the words, 4 more years. And then between November 7th or so to December 31st of 2012, that became the most popular picture in the history of the internet. It was retweeted at a rate of about, I think, 800,000 retweets. It got into that month and a half or so. Fast forward to 2014, Ellen DeGeneres is hosting the Oscars, and she says, let's see if we can beat that same record with my selfie with my A-list actor friends. Let's see if we can beat it by the end of the broadcast. Now, the Oscars are, 3 hours or something? They beat the president's record in 30 minutes.
No.
So it took a month and a half, 2 months, a few years before that, took 30 minutes. Fast forward to a couple months ago, Beyonce's pregnant with twins. She goes to Instagram and she says, hey, everyone, I'm pregnant. This is awesome. And in 1 hour, she had, I want to make sure I have this right, 2.4 million likes. So we're seeing the rapid rate at which people are communicating now, and the power of it to communicate. In these cases, just about, some light politics or, celebrity things. But this goes to the crime aspects as well. And so people are now, we are addicted to sharing things about ourselves. I call it digital narcissism. You guys remember Narcissus, who was so enamored with his own view of himself that he lost something valuable. And I think that we are there now. And we as law enforcement, as prosecutors, as citizens, we get to accept that social media is absolutely a part of everything we do. We'll talk about how it changed things in the Bureau, but it's a part of everything we do, and we cannot ignore it. You have nieces and nephews, sons and daughters, they are using it. And the accounts that they probably showed you that they probably have other ones too that they didn't tell you. So we have to have an awareness of this, and so I look forward to kind of sharing more about that.
So Kristen, let me bring you into the conversation and talk a little bit to us about, from your perspective, how the explosion of social media platforms has really changed the way in which traditional print journalism and places like the Tribune have had to adapt in this new environment.
Well, I mean, it's changed everything. I sometimes feel like, as a newspaper reporter, we're like the sidecar attached to the motorcycle, which is social media, like careening down the highway, just trying to hang on. 1997, I was a police reporter, and I had a pager and a notebook and a police scanner, and I went wherever the police went, and I covered fires, and if my editor wanted to get in touch with me, he paged me, and I had to pull over and find a payphone. We did not have the internet. We had the morgue then. We still have a morgue at the Tribune, but it was paper copies. You would go in the back and dig things out. And so back then, reporting was very much man on the street, phone calls, getting out of the office, talking to people. And at the paper where I was working, the printing press was in the basement, so you could feel the building shake when the presses started to roll. And then you got to go home and go to bed. It was done. It was a done deal. It was on the page for the next day. I mean, everything about that is different with social media, and there are some good things. I cover Springfield a lot for the editorial page of the Chicago Tribune. I can follow people on Twitter who are down there real time. I can watch things real time. The intensity of coverage, I think, is a lot greater because of social media, and one example I can give you is the recent case of the disabled person who was held against his will in an apartment building, and these kids were kicking him and making fun of him, and they scraped off part of his hair and took some scalp, and because that became sort of the water cooler talk of the day, and because we had access to the video of that, we ended up writing an editorial about it, and it became a much bigger story because you can describe that all day long, but once you view it, it's very powerful, and so just the intensity of coverage has changed. I wrote a lot about United Airlines in the past couple of months because of video, so all of that has changed. The news cycle, they say 24 hours, it's actually about every second because you can keep following Twitter, and that's how quickly it changes. From a newspaper business model, it's been a little challenging because we are so late in trying to keep up with digital subscriptions and keeping our business model going, and you can get around our subscription-based platform through social media, so that's made it a little bit more difficult. And I think one interesting part, especially for print, if you go into print media, you're not wanting to be on TV, you prefer being anonymous, and social media has kind of forced reporters to promote their own work. You know, having a Twitter account is sort of part of the job now, promoting it, getting people to click on it, having a brand. It's sort of counterintuitive to, I think, what journalists, at least on the print side, go in to do. So that's one aspect. And lastly, it's kind of, it's tested the objectivity of reporters because now you have a Twitter account, you have this platform, you get to indulge a little bit in your own world. And so even though people say, you know, retweets are not endorsements, you can kind of look at somebody's Twitter page and get a sense of where they are politically. And so we've had some issues with that, but I write for the opinion side, so I can say what I want, basically. But if you are a straight-up news reporter, you have to be really careful, and I think social media has challenged a lot of those boundaries that used to be in place.
So a couple of concepts that we should keep in mind as the discussion goes on. I like the term digital narcissism. It is addictive, and anyone who is, I'm not, but anybody who is on social media, it consumes you. You feel like you've got to keep up with it. You've got to watch it. And we won't talk about the commander-in-chief, but clearly it has an effect, and it's powerful. The amplification of events at speeds at which we've not seen before in our lifetime, also very important, and will play into the rest of our discussion. And an interesting point that Kristen just made about reporters feeling like they need to have a presence and a brand on social media platforms, and how does that inform the way in which they are covering important issues of the day, like crime. Now, Jeff, let's go back to a point that you teased on a little bit, which is, tell us a little bit about how social media and social networks informs the work that you're doing on a day-to-day basis with the FBI.
Well, I work in violent crimes, criminal enterprises, and I was brought here to Chicago to work gangs, to become a subject matter expert on, in particular, African-American gangs. But right now I work actually around the city, Hispanic and African-American gangs. And that speed of information on social media, it is really transformed the way that we do business. When I started with the Bureau a couple years ago, we weren't, on the criminal side, looking that strongly at Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and Twitter. And when I would talk to some of my colleagues, I'd say, why aren't we looking at it? I got two answers usually. One would say, well, you know, I'm just too busy. My caseload's too much to sit there and read a Twitter feed. And other people said, I don't understand how the Facebook works. So since then, we've really had to work hard to address both of those areas, find ways to integrate social media into every one of our investigations, whether we're looking at ISIS or the Black Pea Stones. But then also this education piece, which is not just for the Bureau, but for everyone. So I do trainings on social media awareness. Just make sure that we have a baseline understanding of how Facebook works. Most people have a Facebook account. They don't understand how much information they're actually giving up. Or a Twitter account, or Instagram, how these things actually work, and in particular how they apply to the criminal activity we see. So going back to the digital narcissism, you have young people who are looking to establish themselves. We've been talking about their self-respect and trying to find purpose in their lives. They can feel like they can do that in kind of a paper-thin way on social media, where they can put on the trappings of a big-time baller with the chains or throwing up the gang signs or showing their gats or whatever, or their 30 clips or whatever, and then get likes, and then they feel like they're important. And that leads to all sorts of kinds of activities then, because then people say, oh, well, this person thinks they're all that, and they start using, the 50 strong hashtags, and then the Brick Squad Gangster Disciples might have a problem with that. So yes, we are seeing now this infiltration into, on the criminal side, just a way that social media has to be a part of our investigative work that we do. Because Google has infiltrated everything in our lives, if you have a Google account, you have a Gmail account, hey, there's a possibility you have a YouTube channel. You automatically have a Google Docs account. You may already have a Waze account, because Google owns up to 50 different applications just through one sign-in, essentially. So that's changed how we approach things. So when I talk to my special agent friends and my colleagues, I say, look, if we're doing a proffer, we're talking to a source or someone, and we're trying to get information on a particular person, yeah, get their Yahoo account, get their email account. And years ago, we didn't do that.
Yeah. So Chris, I want you to kind of share with the audience at a high level what you do on a daily basis, and then dig specifically into how social media and social networking impacts the work that you're doing in the streets.
Sure. So since 2010, we've been working with group members. You could call them gang members. They could, Father Mike likes to say organizations. We say group members. Whether it's a group, a clique, a gang, a faction, a block, a squad, whatever they call themselves. It's just the dynamics of group violence and what are the psychological things and the behavioral things that go along with group violence and group violent incidents that occur mainly and predominantly for us, it's shootings and homicides. So what's going on behind that? Who are those individuals? So that's who we work with. So we work with shooters. It's not really an at-risk population. It is the population. It's the folks that are going. You see different things, SSL lists, those types of things. At the end of the day, those are the guys. Like who's pulling triggers right now? Who's getting shot? Who's the next person that's likely to shoot someone? A lot of that comes from social network analysis. We've been working with Professor Papachristos, who Serpis has told us is the smartest man in the world, which makes me feel better. We're going to keep pounding this guy the rest of the day. He's here all night, folks. But what we do is we really have three pillars that we work with. So 3 pillars of partnership. One is law enforcement, and that's local, federal, state, whoever else, the county. Who are the law enforcement partners? The number 2 pillar for us is community. Community is schools, it's churches, it's faith-based, it's community-based, it's individuals in the community. And then the 3rd pillar is we call outreach and support, which are your traditional social service agencies. But we predominantly and almost exclusively work with agencies that work with ex-offenders and gang members, because we have a specific cohort of individuals. They're going to face certain barriers, and if you're not able to quickly get after those barriers, then whether you're well-intentioned or not, I mean, let's face it, a lot of this stuff is perceived in the community, it's sexy stuff. Everyone wants to say they work with gang members, right? Everyone wants to say we're in the thick of it, but very few people are. The way I kind of identify it is who's got PTSD in this room. They're probably doing this work right now. These guys never lose your number. They call you all hours of the night. Their family members call you, and that's okay. But what we do is we try to bring that group together, and we try to just at the end of the day, our goal is to reduce shootings and homicides amongst group members, not overall shootings and homicides. Very specific and surgically, these group members who are in there. We do it through what we call 2 means. One is custom notifications. Those are door-to-door visits. We always do things with all 3 pillars. It's not law enforcement going by themselves. It's not community going by itself. It's not outreach going by themselves. We all go together. We give a collective message. The violence is unacceptable. We cannot have it anymore. We'll stop you if you make us. We'll help you if you let us. That's the abridged version right there. And then there's always an offer for help. So law enforcement, hey, I call it a honeymooners intervention. I know that you know who I know, who you are, who you're with, who you're allied with, who you're beefing with, how this is going down, who's locked up, what the next thing is, and who the next target is likely to be because of the scenario that's going on the street. There's no press, there's no politicians, there's none of that. It's just a little engagement right there on the spot. Following the law enforcement part of the conversation, community jumps in. And the community members, we have regular community members. We have partnered with mothers and support groups who've lost their their children to violence. The moms that we've partnered with specifically, their young men have been involved in the violence, so they're not, in the stroller catching a stray. Their young man was pulling triggers, and then he had triggers being pulled in his direction. And she gives a very candid account of what's going on and an offer from the community standpoint, which is basically the community. We love you, we need you, we value you. But we want you in your rightful place. We'd argue the place you found on the street right now is not your rightful place in our community from our lens. And then the last is always the offer for help. We always give an offer for help, one point of contact, one provider. The person you're talking to at your doorstep will case manage you. We do the same thing in a group setting. We call it call-ins. And that's where we have a representative from every faction in that police district. Many of you in the room have hosted them for us, and we thank you for it. We don't do it in a police station or the courthouse. We do it at a place of community significance because we want them to come back. We want to begin to establish that relationship and those ties. To date, we've been doing this for about 6 years. We've done over 2,400 door-to-door visits. We've done over 80 call-ins, and we've connected with over 3,500 gang members in this. And I won't get into all the stats of how many have been shot, how many have asked for help, those types of things. I can if you want to ask the question later, but for time's sake, I'll talk real quick about the social network analysis. Andy, I'm sure will touch on it. The beginning of our work really kind of began with the seed of Andrew's study of Garfield Park from 2005 to 2010, and really looking at of 90,000 people, and correct me if I'm wrong, Andy, 90,000 people, about 1,700, 1,800 people were involved in about 70 to 80% of every shooting and every homicide. So to me, that's not great news, but it's better news that, it's not the Wild West. It's not everybody. It's 0.5% to 2% of your population that's driving this thing. So as the superintendent said, how do we get the focus on that 0.5% to 2%, not just from a law enforcement perspective, but really turn our eye and our spotlight of our social services, our outreach, our support, our faith-based contribution? How do we turn that spotlight to that group as well? The legal community, how can we do that to provide the support where you have the driving force of our violence is coming from a very small pocket of individuals? Do we have the solution? Do we have it right? Are we putting our solutions in the right bucket? Now, everything's important, but what are we doing for that population? So that's what we look at. As far as the social media impact, I will tell you the brazenness of what you see. What Jeffrey mentioned earlier, guys posting up. This is my way to post up. I call it cyber gangbanging. You got these I'm going to gangbang behind the keyboard today. And I'm going to do it I could do it as long as I want. I don't have to stand in the cold. I don't have to worry about somebody, I forget who was mentioning earlier, always looking over my shoulder because I'm sitting in my living room, I'm sitting in my bedroom, I'm sitting on a laptop, I'm sitting on my cell phone, wherever I may be. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm disrespect you, and I'm going to do the YouTube videos and have my own YouTube channel and wait until Lori leaves the house and then drive up with 10 of my buddies, get a little camera, post something up and say, we're here, where are you, we own your street, and then all of a sudden, what we call, I kind of refer to it sometimes, it's like gangbanger ping pong, right? She shoots at me, I shoot at her. Jeffrey shoots at her, she shoots at me. Amy jumps in somewhere. It's like a ping pong match. And then you have, all of a sudden you look up and 3 months later you got 14 shootings in one neighborhood off of something that popped up on a YouTube video. And you can literally begin to trace these things back, or some type of disrespect.
So Professor, let's move to you. First, tell us a little bit about the work that you've been doing on social networking, and then I'm going to ask you some more specific questions. Go ahead.
Okay, first things first, I got to know my audience. Ron, for all his publicity, forgot to mention that I was born and spent the first 32 consecutive years of my life in Chicago, that my sister's finishing her 21st year as a Chicago public school teacher, more importantly for this conversation, that names like Benji Wilson, Dantrell Davis, Yummy Sandifer actually have deep meaning for me as someone who grew up in the 80s and 90s in Chicago. So that's the first thing. So Northwestern, University of Chicago, give me a call. Yale, calls, you got to go where the work is, right? So I just want to start with that.
I view that as an invitation to get you back in Chicago. So
I'm
we'll
just
work on
putting it
that.
out there. I'm just putting it out there because, it's the same thing. Okay, let's move on. I don't have a lot of time. What I study social networks, not actually social media. But the reason it's relevant is because a lot of the action around social media, we really care about it not just because of the harm it causes, the trauma it causes to users, how bad it makes you feel in general, right? But actually how it translates into action in the real world. And so network science, what I kind of do, is the study of how our social relationships, the people we marry, the people we hang out with, the people we fight, affect what we feel, think, and do. The votes we cast, the people we marry, the people we sleep with, the jobs we get, the promotions we don't get, that's a function of our social network. And we have a way, the old boys club, it's not what you know, but who you know. All true. And in fact, there are methods that we can use to help understand it. And we do this in public health to understand how a disease spreads. We do this in polling to understand how opinion spreads, right? And so what I do is I take this logic to understand how it is how people become at risk of being the victim of a gunshot injury, right? So could we skip to slide 15? Put a professor in front of a microphone. You guys know you're 15, 1-5. I have like 80 slides, but I'm still going to do it. Hang on, I'm going to go back myself real quick. Okay, yeah, okay, going backwards. Don't focus that. Sorry. Punchlines you're going to see in reverse. All right, let's talk about a different city, Boston. Every single one of those dots you're looking at is a human being, a young man of color with a criminal record in the city of Boston, right? And this is actually one high crime community, and there are 763 dots on this map. Those lines connecting the individuals are instances of co-arrest or instances of co-contact with the police. So if Chris and I rob a bank, we have a tie, right? And then if Kristen and I rob a different bank, we have a tie, and these things link together. And they create this network. And what you're looking at is a social map, a map of the landscape of people doing risky things in this Boston community. Now, those red dots are the gunshot victims, right? And so if you're looking at this figure, what you see is those things clump. It's a very scientific term, together, right? Like my kid, probably my oldest, took a handful of Christmas ornament and threw them right at the tree, right? There's only a couple of instances where you don't see more than one gunshot victim next to each other. You see 2, you see 3, you see 4, you see 5, you see 6. So they hang together. And conversely, you see whole parts where there are no shootings. And from our traditional way of approaching it, you have to keep in mind that these are all essentially young men of color in a high crime community, right, that have all the same risk factors, but it's just a small group of them that are really at elevated risk. And it's 6% of this community's population, but almost all of the gunshot victims, except for instances of self-harm, are in this network. The other that are excluded, by the way, are domestic violence, which is a different conversation, probably a different summit, though we should be talking about it. So you can do this for a whole neighborhood. And I just want to point out that those are individuals already in our system. The criminal justice system, the foster care system, the healthcare system, the education system, and preachers, teachers, cops, they live in these networks, right? We know who these people are. We can do something. And we can do this for entire cities. Here's East Palo Alto. This is not where Facebook is. That's Palo Alto, literally across the train tracks. But for an entire city, once again, you can see those red dots, like Christmas lights, strung across this network, right? And we know who those are individuals, sons, daughters, brothers, fathers, right? We know who they are. We have more information than a statistic on them. And this is what Chicago looks like, right? So one of the big things about Chicago is it's big. We could have had, in a Chicago fashion, a debate about whether Boston is a real city or not. But we don't, but Chicago is big. And a lot of things create these networks. Institutional racism, segregation, those drive how the networks are created. But once you're in these networks, what we find, to get back to Lori's original question, is once you're in these networks and once you're surrounded by people who are getting victimized, your rate skyrockets. Your individual rate, Andrew Papachristos' rate of being a victim can go from 0 to 40. right? And our studies suggest a couple of things. One, that the baseline rate for most people in these networks of getting shots starts at about 11% and can go up to about 40%. Now, let me put this in perspective. The odds of getting shot in a game of Russian roulette are about 16%, right? So if you knew that Andy or Chris or Kristen, sorry to keep pulling you in this, if my rate were 40%, what are our obligations to help that person? What should we do to help that person? And I have plenty of thoughts on that, starting with treating them like a victim, not an offender. What does this have to do with social media? So I'm going to show you one more thing, which is the people in this network are on social media, and I don't actually do social media analysis, but I'm going to show you one figure that really points it out. How many of you heard of Keef Chief, Lil Jojo? Mm-hmm. Right? Okay. So there's a debate that played out on social media, but here they are in that big network I showed you, right? And so those red dots are some of the players on the online feud and the drill music, and those orange dots, those are their associates who were also gunshot victims. So what you see is the social media and the network analysis, they overlap in complementary ways. These are individuals who aren't just singing about it, they're living in it, but it's still a small number of individuals. I mean, there are a lot of people on this graph, right? There's almost 60 individuals. But it's 60 individuals in communities, as Chris was saying, 90,000, 45,000. And we know who these individuals are, and they're in our various systems, that we can have contact with them in ways that are deep and meaningful. So I'll stop right there for the
All right,
moment.
let me bring Amy into the conversation, who's been waiting patiently. Sorry. So you've heard the conversation, particularly from Jeff, Chris, and now Andrew, about how folks who are ending up in the criminal justice system are using social media, that their networks are using social media, that feuds and petty grievances get played out over social media. And obviously, without a reference to any particular case, we've seen some recent cases here in Chicago where Facebook Live has been used to portray conduct that has subsequently been branded criminal conduct. Talk to us a little bit about the challenges that you and your colleagues now face in representing individuals in the age of social media, particularly when they decide that it's a really good idea to show themselves in a video that is readily available to law enforcement.
Well, obviously, that challenge is huge. Social media changes, right, how people view criminal cases, right? It allows prejudgment of the case. It also overwhelms the other aspects of the criminal justice system. Take, for example, a Facebook Live case, any case, and the constant replaying of the video over and over for the whole world to see forever. Now, the video can then overwhelm the purpose, say, of the bond hearing. The purpose of a bond hearing is to determine whether you are a threat to public safety or a flight risk, right? It's not to determine whether the accused is guilty or not guilty, but, or whether the judge believes he's already guilty, because you're presumed innocent at the bond hearing. But it does change that, and it changed the perception at the bond hearing, and it shouldn't. Similarly, social media can overwhelm the trial process for judges and juries. So social media video, the photos, the outbursts we see, they wind up sometimes carrying more weight than the in-court testimony of witnesses. Why? Because now we're expected to always have video of a crime. Juries expect that. They think, oh, I'm going to see the video of the crime. It's going to be easy, 1, 2, 3, right? Guilty, not guilty. The days, as we know, of flip charts and easels are over, right? So social media also taints the reliability and gathering of evidence. We've had witnesses or victims of crimes who have gotten pictures off a Facebook page and walked around their neighborhood and asked individuals to identify the perpetrator. Not talking about law enforcement, I'm talking about citizens. And then that then becomes a confirmation of that person who sees the photograph in their belief that that is the person who they saw commit the crime. So we have rules and laws to stop and law enforcement from suggesting identifications of individuals. But we have no rules or laws for the citizens who go around and show pictures and say, is this the person you saw commit the crime? Is this the person, right? So we need rules on that. Social media enables then maybe a false identification, which then of course could lead to a wrongful conviction. In addition, Jurors sometimes do their own investigation of attorneys and witnesses via social media and other sites like LinkedIn. So jurors tweet sometimes about the trials they're hearing. Judges tell them they're not to do that. Sometimes they take their phones away, but they do. And then they express judgment about the case before all the evidence has been heard. With social media and video, objections that occur, and this sort of goes to Kristen, during motions or trials can be sustained in the courtroom, but the traditional media, like Kristen, the Tribune sometimes, remains free to report on it, many times on their own social media pages, right? The Trib and Sun-Times. So evidence is barred in the courtroom, but the public remains exposed to it because it's out there on a social media site. So our focus has been and always should be, right, truth-seeking, determining the evidentiary value of any information on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Snapchat, Instagram. So we need to know how the social media evidence can or will be used in court. That's what the defense attorney needs to know. What it will prove or not prove, whether the information has possibly been manipulated. And that starts with access to the evidence. Obviously, law enforcement has a different way to access the evidence. But like for us, let's say I have a homicide case, and the defense is self-defense. The reputation of the deceased in that case has evidentiary value. So if there's a photograph, and we've seen this, of the decedent with a gun in his hand, bragging about past exploits, right, I should be able to use that in my self-defense case because the reputation of the decedent is at issue in a self-defense case. So that can be very important evidence for us. And even though everyone agrees that I should have that evidence and be able to use it, it's difficult. Facebook requires a warrant to get their evidence. I cannot get their evidence through a subpoena or a court order. They require a warrant, which I think is good. It's a protection of privacy. I think we should have privacy in our Facebook if it's on a non-public site. But it's a hurdle for the defense attorney. I have to go into court. I am a citizen. I have to ask for a warrant, which I can do based on an affidavit, and then the judge has to agree with me and give me the warrant so I can get the information on Facebook. Lastly, I just want to point out that, in my opinion, I think social media has created this sort of, I don't know, two-tiered system of justice, I guess, based upon whether the incident is on video and posted or not. Perfect example is Ray Rice, right? The football player. So he was arrested for fighting with his fiancée in the elevator. You remember that. Now, when it first happened, there was no video, right? He was charged with
That was released.
right.
I
Nobody
hasten to add.
No, when he was arrested, it wasn't low-level video, right, no video. The charges were going to be dropped, right, or whatever. He was going to go to counseling. They were staying together. This was his fiancée. Then TMZ posted the video. Everything changed. Rice was suspended indefinitely now from the NFL versus before. He was just suspended for 2 days, and the commissioner said he got it wrong. There were outcries that the criminal charges should be reinstated, not been dropped. The point is, everything changed because the video that was posted. But crimes are not different simply because they are captured on video. However, judges and juries can be and are affected by what's in the public eye. It's just a reality.
So I'm going to go to Kristen, but I want to ask this question of, I'm going to lump you in, Chris, with law enforcement. People out there that are committing crimes aren't stupid. They know that law enforcement, well, maybe they're stupid sometimes, right? But they know that law enforcement has also figured out, oh, by the way, Lori's out there on Facebook throwing signs, got an AK-47 or whatever the weapon of choice is. Why do you think, in light of that fact, in light of the fact that for years now you've been using social media as an effective tool in examining crime and trying to prevent it, why is it still being used? And maybe, Andrew, I'll start with you if you have a view of that question.
So I think it's being used because there are things that we know happen. I mean, like many of you in this room, I'm glad social media didn't exist when I was in college. I mean, but the fact that you can actually see things that are already there. I think there's a danger which goes to the social narcissism, which I'm going to call statistical narcissism, which is, I think, one of the dangers in using it in law enforcement and I can talk about in violence prevention as well, to answer, is that when you pick one Facebook page, that person by default is the start of your network and is the center of the world, right? Which is very different than the graphs I showed you, which are a map of the whole world, as it were, right? And so there's actually, from where I sit, when you do that, it's like, oh my God, Andy's the most important person in the world. Why? Well, I started with this Facebook page, and look how many friends he has, right? And you kind of take it out from there, which is very different. I will say, I've seen positive uses of social media by violence interrupters, by street outreach workers, by police, where they can cool things down online as well, or where they can say to somebody like, Chris, I saw you, ragging on Jeff online, what's up with that? Like, hit me on an instant message or something like that. I've seen that happen. Whether it works in the sense where I do an evaluation and it works, I don't know. But what I know is I see people using it as a tool to do the work that they're doing. So if you're not monitoring the social media of the kids in your school or in your classroom or in your neighborhood, you're missing a whole part of their lives. And as a parent, I know when I talk with my boys about this, it's just an extension of the middle school right now, right? Like what happens online, they don't see the difference between cyberbullying and like regular bullying. It's just bullying, right? And it's instantaneous and it happens and it's awful, but it's contained. So I think you do have to look at and sort of understand what's going on online. I think it can be used for intervention purposes. I think there are creative uses that I see schools doing in particular. I think that's a good use of it. There are obviously all kinds of the bad uses that we were just talking about. I think one thing it does, in the context of street organizations and crews is, it amplifies everything because it doesn't stop, right? It's just constantly turning up the volume each time, and every group can do it, and any kid can be who they want to be online. So that's my initial reaction.
Chris, you have any thoughts about that? I mean, when we talked briefly the other day, you talked about there are some folks who aim for that infamy on social media.
Yes, I think part of it is you just have to look at the impulsive nature of human beings, understanding that the majority of the people pulling triggers are not juveniles. That's a common narrative, but it's actually juveniles are not the majority of the problem here. So you're looking at young men, right? The impulsive nature of something happens. There's some groups right now in the city, and their response to things is they look to get locked up to see what other people are doing. I mean, the psychology of it it's amazing. You wouldn't believe it, but it's true. And they'll say comments like, your shit didn't even make the news. Your shit didn't make the Sun-Times. Or my stuff made the Trib, and we know the white people read the Trib, so if my shit made the Trib, my stuff is more higher elevated than yours. So you have that type of particular engagement going on. Social media is used as a platform for people to broadcast. Before, and I remember Superintendent Johnson was saying early this morning, it used to be about turfism and those types of things and sales of drugs in my territory. Now it's a very quick way for me to be a small faction on the southeast side of Chicago to platform my ferocity in the gangbanging world and in the criminal world through the whole city just by hitting the right buttons on my keyboard and getting my stuff out there. So you look at it, you use it as a platform to broadcast your status. You see right now, you'll see pictures of, I don't know if you remember, I might be dating myself, but they used to say, these are the linebackers for the Giants or for Notre Dame. This is the best defensive line in the country, and there's a picture of guys from the University of Pittsburgh. Well, now you see things where we're the Wick City Black Disciple shooters, and there's 7 people up there holding guns saying like, hey, we're the hit squad. So who do you think is looking at that? The ops are watching it and the cops are watching it. But you're putting it all out there saying, I'm the shooter. So if I'm really not a shooter, that's very dangerous business for me to involve myself in that picture, because who do you think Jeff is going to be looking for when he comes out? So there's the bragging of the status, who are the shooters, the hitters, the lineup, the weaponry. I remember going to a few, doing the door-to-door visits, and sometimes we'll go to the home, and mom saying, you got my kid all wrong. Here we go again. You're picking on our kid. This is the police department. You're all bad. You're this, you're that. And there's community members there. And why are you with the police? And you're framing my kid. And then someone will put out a picture. Is this your child's Facebook page? Do you recognize this kid? And it's their kid holding fire, brandishing firearms, standing behind the mantle that we're standing behind in your living room, with the kid wearing a hat that's hanging on his bedpost in his bedroom. And then it's like, okay, let's sit down and talk. You know, but however you get there, you get there. Just the fearlessness, you're fearless behind the keyboard, right? Bloggers, right? Commentators, people who tweet a lot, you're fearless because there's no one that you have to go face to face with. There's no one you have to eyeball, like a drive-by shooting versus getting in front of somebody and stabbing them. You do it from a distance, you do it from safety, you have a quick exit. And then certain things like, you know, I'm going to post up, I'm angry, so I'm going to say I'm after everybody, I don't care who comes after me, CPDK, meaning Chicago Police Department killer. Now you have that on your Facebook account or whatever, Instagram. You have yourself with a picture with an AR-15 rifle talking about you kill cops. Whether you do it or not, whether you're just bragging or not, you know, it's not a good look. And then the last thing is bragging about deeds. So there's bragging about status, then there's bragging about deeds. The young lady that Bishop Duke spoke of this morning with the cap and gown picture, she was actually someone that we were working with. And we worked with her for a while before she was killed. And yes, and yes, and yes, it was a litany of stuff that was going on. She was going back and forth taunting her opposition every time she would allegedly shoot and allegedly, that's right, Amy, right? Allegedly.
Yes, thank you.
She would allegedly shoot and allegedly kill somebody. She would post something. Within 30 minutes of her murder, her nickname was whatever. It was night, night, such and such. Night, night, such a, like the ops were putting that stuff out right away. Like, you're done, this is over. We've taken care of our business. So there's bragging about deeds, the insults that Andy talked about as well. And then other things we'll see is, you know, when something happens, and I may not be claiming that I did it, but I'll say something like, Shorty had it coming. You know, who's the next target now? You know, so, and like that, Andy said, that social network, the little JoJo Chief Keef thing, how many shootings, and Bishop Dukes was in the room with Commander Schmitz when we were sitting as a community trying to figure this thing out. How many homicides and shootings were tied to that social media out? It was one or two social media outbursts that broke out between two individuals. And at the end of it, when it's all said and done, we had, I guess, maybe 16 or more orange shooting dots and 5 or 6 red homicide dots.
So I'll say it. This is a level of insanity that is incredibly disturbing. Now, you all are in the trenches on this every day, but I'm going to come back to Kristen, but the general question is, what do we do? We see this happening. We know we're dealing with a population whose brains have not fully matured. Even if we're talking about the folks who are most likely to be the shooters, which I think is 20 to 29-year-old, and Rosanna will correct me later if I'm wrong about that, something has to give. Because if now the power of social media that Jeffrey, I thought, talked about so eloquently at the front end is now being used to amplify these petty grievances and frankly probably false bragging about what their stature is, what do we do about that? What do we do about that? And think about that question, but I want to bring Kristen into it. From the media perspective, and you heard Amy talk about one of the core tenets of our democracy is making sure that defendants get a fair trial, not just the perception of it, but the reality of it. And I want to ask, when the Tribune thinks about reporting on crime, and you go back a ways on crime reporting, are you thinking about the defendant's rights to a fair trial? Are you thinking about, if I report the lurid details of a crime, am I essentially spawning the possibility of glorifying what's happened? Are we running the risk of spawning copycats? Now, again, I know that's not your core responsibility, but how do those kinds of considerations, if at all, filter into both the stories that you choose to tell and the way in which you tell them?
So I'll answer that question just not directly related to the Tribune newsroom, because now that I'm on opinion, I'm not part of the day-to-day decisions on the Tribune newsroom, but I have been a reporter before I moved over to opinion for almost 20 years. So I'll answer on that regard. Yes, I mean, all of those things come into play from the moment that a reporter shows up on a scene. I think the type of person that you get to be a reporter who's on the police beat tends to be someone who tries to be sensitive to all of those things. I mean, there are some really basic ground rules that we do that aren't probably satisfying to someone like Amy, who we're making her job more difficult. But we are very careful when reporting any sort of an arrest or an indictment to make sure we do use allegedly, accused of. We have an in-house lawyer who sometimes I read a story and I can tell that she's had her hands all over it because everything is very carefully worded. The rank and file reader might not recognize that, but it is something where we try to be as careful as possible to do. I've been writing some editorials about a state official who is under federal investigation, and while the evidence against him at this point looks sort of damning, we are again careful in every single piece to say he has not been accused of any wrongdoing. Try to get his side of the story, reach out to him, talk to his lawyer. Those are all things we do to try to keep that into account. But we are also faced with the need, the defendant's right to a fair trial, but also the public's right to know. And so as a newspaper, that's probably going to outweigh most of that decision-making. Transparency, more information is always better. And in terms of like the lurid details of crimes, I mean, some crimes are extremely lurid, and I don't know that you want journalists cleansing what actually happened. In addition to that, what we get our hands on is often already been, some of it the police haven't even released. They have redacted reports. We have withheld, anytime I would write a crime story, only maybe 10% of what I actually knew and covered makes it into the story. There are other guidelines. We don't name minors. We're not, the Tribune, we're not the Daily News in New York where they gore and blood sell. We try to be very sensitive. Even when we did, for example, we did post the video of the disabled person that I mentioned earlier when he was held against his will. We were kind of late in getting that video up because we edited it, we blurred faces, we put a warning up to make sure people understand they're going to see something sort of disturbing. So we aren't really, we don't shoot from the hip maybe as much as people think. And lastly, to the point about copycatting, there was a lot of discussion in the journalism community after a number of school shootings to not name the perpetrator, not put their faces on television, not put their names in the headline, not use art of them holding weaponry and different things to kind of soothe their egos and make a copycat case. But again, we're not going to not cover it. This is life. This is life in our city. And I think when the Tribune often puts crime stories on the front page, it's exactly where they should be. And we would be even more numb to crime here if we were doing what we did. There was a phase where newspapers, I think in Chicago and elsewhere, and when I started out covering the police beat, it was a blotter. It was on like page A9, and it was just a little tiny, collection of crime stories, very much broken down. So I think it's appropriate that crime stories in the city, given what we're facing, are on the front page.
Let me just answer your question about what we can do. When I go to schools, I go to the high schools and where 80% of the kids are involved in the criminal justice system. And I think it goes to both things. We're never going to stop the flow of guns, it doesn't seem, and we're not going to stop social media. So how do we stop the kids from picking up the guns, and how do we stop the kids from using social media to commit crimes? So that's really what we have to focus on. And when I talk to the kids that are involved, like Chris says, most of the shooters are not the juveniles, but the juveniles are carrying guns. A lot of my kids who are arrested and are over sitting in the juvenile detention center right now have gun cases. And when I talk to them and I say, what do I need to do to get you to not pick up the gun? They always tell me the same thing. I need to feel safe, and I need a job. All the time. I don't make this up. That's what I ask them, and that's what they tell me. So if I can get these kids jobs, if I can make them feel safe in their communities, then they won't pick up the gun, because we know the guns are there. We're not going to stop that. Now, social media is the same thing. How can I get you to stop cyberbullying and doing what you need? You don't want to come my way. What we do is we go to the schools and we educate the kids about this is a crime. And we give them hypotheticals, and they always get them wrong. They don't know it's a crime. They don't know taunting someone, and they brag, right? They lie all the time. They exaggerate. So that's why the law enforcement using the social media, the monitoring is important. Who's watching law enforcement? Who's watching the watchers? Because I need to know that it's reliable. I need to know it's not going to infect my case. I need to know that the evidence that the judge hears or the jury hears is proper, reliable, relevant evidence. Because every one of us deserves that. I don't care what you're charged with. I don't care if you've been on Facebook Live 10 times. I don't care if that video's been shown 100 times. You still have a right to a fair trial. And if it was your kid or your son or your daughter or your cousin, you'd want that for them. So social media causes a lot of problems, but we got to get them to stop doing it.
Yeah.
And that's what we need to do.
Andrew?
I just want to add something which, and it's not meant to be like a big thing, but we could also harness it for good, right? So if it's a small percentage of folks that are using the social media for these purposes, we should be doing the opposite and using social media to propagate the good messages, the good cases, the good things that are happening in the neighborhood. This is something where we can empower communities to use social media to get those stories out, and don't be like, oh, I'm not going to retweet it because it's lame. No, retweet it. It's free. Like tweeting is free. It doesn't cost you anything, right? We should be thinking about the success stories in these contexts, about the shootings that were avoided, about the young kids who were succeeding in such a way that it gets the same attention. And I'm not going to pick on the media because we've already done that. We can probably going to do that a little bit more in just a second. But like, we don't need them to do that, actually. We can do that, and you can find high-profile people. Why isn't Ellen DeGeneres tweeting about that, right? Or why can't we get a sports star or a performer to do that, right? Where's Common? What is he doing about his hometown? He should be retweeting, right? Who's reinvesting? You can use the same logic against itself, right? To help get those messages out there in a way that are profoundly important. And actually, just as one quick example, first-generation college students like myself, and probably many of you in this room, there's these new experiments that says if you just send them a little text message that says, hey, it's finals week, have you slept, right? Have you eaten? That they will do better, right? So you can use social media to send pushes in little ways that can actually have a profound impact on people's lives. And it might not make the front page of the Tribune or the Sun-Times or Vox or whatever, right? But there's something there that has a power that we've seen, that we've been talking about. But I just want to say the converse can also exist if we want it to.
All right,
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I would say I'm the guy in Jeff's office who's like, what is this Facebook you talk of, Facebook, what is that? We don't know that. I'm that guy. So I'm definitely not the guy for this job. But again, we operate in a realm of strategy. What is strategic? What makes sense, right? If you look at the world of the military, right? In the military, you'll do three things when you're going to, you declare something against someone else. Number one, you do reconnaissance. You survey the battlefield, right? Number two, after you've surveyed the battlefield, you prepare the battlefield. For us, that's just bombing the crap out of it, right? And then only after you've surveyed it and you've prepared it, then do you engage in battle. What we do in the realm of social services and outreach and support is we dive right into the battle and we get right into engagement, and then we try to survey and prepare while we're engaged because of the nature of the crisis that we're engaged with. So what I would say is that, to the point of, well, what do you do? How do you flip this social media thing? Everything kind of trails something else, right? It's like drug testing in the Olympics, right? The guys that are cheating are always 3 steps ahead, it seems like, than the guys who are testing them for cheating. And then once they catch up, they're 2 more steps ahead of where they were. It seems like in our world, cybercrime takes place, and then after cybercrime is taking place, law enforcement catches up to it and says, okay, now we're going to have cyber enforcement. So you got cybercrime and cyber enforcement. To Andrew's point and other folks, where's our cyber intervention? So if we have outreach on the street, it's kind of like outmoded and outdated a little bit. Do we have room for cyber intervention? Can we get that kicked up and get that going? I moonlight and coach high school football at Phillips High School. And I will tell you, our head coach has each of us as position coaches. Every single kid that plays offensive line underneath me, I have his Twitter account, his cyber, all that type of stuff. And we will call a kid and say, Jeff, take it down. And he'll take it down. the influence of the coach. So there's different things that you can do, but who are those people that have influence and they give you access? In fact, I demand, if you want to play for me, you friend me on this thing. And then I get my 17-year-old kid and I say, what is it? Look at this. Did somebody do something stupid? Give me a call, and tell them to do such and such. But I think cyber intervention, I think that's the key to help contextualize. Right, our guys get all types of content on their own now. The millennials that Ron Serpis talked about, they get their own content. They still need assistance, though, contextualizing that content. So from Amy's perspective, protect yourself. If you're in that lifestyle, protect yourself. Don't post stupid stuff. And from a public safety perspective, contextualize what some of the dangers and harms may be.
Let me ask one last question before I turn it over to you all to ask questions, and I'll pick on Jeff. We have been kind of operating in this conversation so far with the assumption that law enforcement's deep involvement in social media, monitoring social media, is just fine. But let me challenge you a little bit. There are obviously limits, and I think we all ought to be concerned about where those lines are drawn. What do you do in the day-to-day to make sure that you're doing things on the right side of the line, and where need be, you're seeking appropriate guidance from lawyers and judges to authorize you to get into social media?
Well, yeah, that's a fair question. Well, we should be concerned about anyone looking at your content and that they are following constitutional procedures. And the FBI is no different. And we do make sure that we follow not only the Constitution, making sure that we protect people's First and Fourth Amendment rights, but we've added on top of that. We have a domestic investigative operations guide, the DIOG, DIOG is what we call it. That is on top of constitutional protections. And that DIOG has a section called the Appendix L. It was approved, I want to say 2 years ago or so, after a lot of work with our lawyers. And what it does is it gives people like myself and my colleagues guidance on how we should do our investigations. And not only does it just say, hey, make sure that you go through legal process before you, do something undercover. You have to be certified to do that. Okay, that makes sense. Here's the process for doing that. If you are, and it gives scenarios which say if you are looking at subject A and you happen to run across information on subject B, what do you do about it? What legal process should you follow on our side with our assistant state's attorneys, our AUSAs, to make sure that we are following proper protocol and we aren't infringing upon people's constitutional rights? When you ask about what we should do, I would say that I can only speak for my organization, but I think that from DEA to ATF, the U.S. Attorney's Office, there needs to be some sort of organization of how we do social media exploitation and analysis. There needs to be rules in place that are understood by our side, by defense, that say, okay, here are the rules of the game. This is what's out there on social media. This is how you are able to do it. We've talked with Facebook and Google and Yik Yak, and we've understood what they can provide for us. Having that groundwork then says, okay, well, here is now situation between Chief Keef and Little JoJo. How does that apply to the established rules that all these agencies and defense attorneys and everyone, we're all going to operate to approach this problem with an understanding of how we're going to do things. If your organization, your agency doesn't have a process in place, a policy to say how you're going to capture information from social media, how long you're going to keep it, what are you going to do with it, who can capture that information, it is a Pandora's box, which given the longevity now of social media, it's a time bomb. So I'm pleased that we have the dialogue with FBI, and I would say that we need to have some sort of, I'm just making another term up here, but like a social media czar, someone on the law enforcement side who can help to wrangle all this information, all these disparate agencies, and make sense of it so that the public and defense, everyone has understanding of what we can do and how we do it.
If I could just jump in real quick.
Yeah, please.
Because this is relevant to what you were talking about. I don't know how detailed you read Zach Farden's resignation letter, but he addresses this. I don't want to get into, I don't know how this crowd feels about him, but he talked about bringing in the tech geeks and testing the constitutional limits of people who, if you land on CPD's strategic subject list, you lose some privileges and you might lose access to your social media account. Or there's a way to have an automatic alert with all of the law enforcement agencies if you start, just by making it on that list, which again, that raises a lot of questions about the constitutional rights of that person. But that is something he suggested in his goodbye letter.
So we already have 2 questions up here, which I'll start with, and then I think we've got a microphone that we can pick up other questions from the audience, and this is for Amy. We all, I think, who practice in the criminal courts remember that a few years back, there was a ban that was put in place on individuals, non-lawyers, bringing cell phones into the criminal courts. The question is, and I'm not sure that this is specifically a responsibility of the Cook County Public Defender, but it's directed to you, and you're happy to pivot it to maybe the courts or the state's attorney's office. What are you all, from your perspective, doing to ensure the safety of witnesses, victims, accused, and defendants from the proliferation of cell phones and the cell phones being used as like a cyber weapon in individual criminal cases?
Well, just from my perspective, like I was talking about, when we have a whole team of people in my office who do community outreach now, that was one of my initiatives when I came in, and we go to the schools and we talk to the kids about using their cell phones. And we talk to the kids about going online and putting things online and how dangerous it is and that it's always out there and everybody's gonna see it and it never goes away. So it's hard for them to realize that, but once they think about it, and then once we give them hypotheticals about if, it's the sexting issue, right? That's a big one. Well, I can't send a naked picture of my girlfriend. She wants me to, right? To someone else. I'm like, no, that's child pornography. Please don't do that. You're going to be charged with a crime. So, these are things that kids don't know. So we try to educate them about what's a crime and what's not a crime. And certainly when someone comes into a courthouse, there's rules in place. So you can't bring your phone in. Certainly the judges and the sheriffs make announcement before court starts if people have their phones. Turn them off, don't use them, you can't pull them out. It's just the education piece, right?
Yeah.
What is it? I don't want people to be charged with having a cell phone, right? They came to court for a different reason. Now they're going to be charged with having a cell phone in the courtroom. I don't need that. I don't need a witness who now becomes my client because they had a cell phone. So education is key, making sure signs are posted so everybody knows the rules about having a phone or not having a phone. But I think the Assistant State's Attorney also, and I think I've talked to Kim about this, about much more education through her victim witness panel, educating her witnesses about what to do in that situation.
So our second question, I think, is an issue that has permeated this discussion the entire day, which is how are African-American males being portrayed who are intersecting or not intersecting with the criminal justice system? And I think this is really probably primarily for Kristen, but when we use terms like gang-related, when we say that victims are associated with gangs, there's a concern in the community, I think, that we are depersonalizing them, that we're saying that they are less worthy of our sympathy and support. How do we address that issue when we're talking about, frankly, the fact that we do have a proliferation of gangs, we do have a gun problem in the city? How do we strike that balance from your perspective?
I mean, I definitely think the media can do a better job. I was actually surprised to see the word gangbanger in print recently, or maybe it was in a headline. I mean, you all use those terms. They've been using them up here. I personally, as a reporter, wouldn't. And I think reporters and maybe even prosecutors to some extent rely on that gang affiliation association without enough digging. My sister is a caseworker who deals with juveniles, and they get a tattoo when they're 13, and then that tattoo is somehow linked to a gang, and then they're gang affiliated for the next 10, 15 years, whatever, throughout the criminal justice system. And it changes everything. It changes their charge. So I definitely think we could do a better job of disposing of some of that just terminology, and also, as media, making the police be a little bit more accountable if you're going to label this person in such a way, and making it easier, especially for juveniles, to kind of get out from under that classification in their paperwork.
Andrew, let me fold you into this discussion as well. When you're thinking about making these connections between people based upon their arrest history, What are you doing, if anything, and thinking about, well, am I linking this person forever to a criminal activity that they may not be a part of anymore? And how do we avoid doing that in the work that you're doing?
Sure. So the first thing is all of the sort of uses that I try to help, I try to think about it as data informed, right? So I never think you should spit out a score, generate a list, and then like start going down a list. I actually think that's
Something like the strategic subject
perhaps
list or
I've been
something
very
like that?
vocal
Yeah.
about that. But what I do think you can do actually is take that information, and I'm going to say something which also tie back and maybe mix things up a tiny bit, and say, look, and everybody knows who this person is in the network. Rarely have I worked with a violence prevention organization that said, I've never heard of Andrew Papachristos before or Chris Millette before, which means if someone knows that Papachristos, he's got a job, he's doing okay, that's not the person that you should then necessarily be talking to. You should go to the next person, right? So you have to combine sort of human intelligence with data, full stop. I will say something else, though, about this model, which is why this sort of integration of human intelligence and data becomes really important, because even though I might not be in the game anymore or whatever, if all of a sudden people around me start getting shot, I might actually be at risk, right? And so I might have not, been on the corner for a couple years, but all of a sudden, my friends are getting shot, and I'm going to the same parties as them. I might actually be at risk, even though I'm not a gang member anymore, right? And that's actually, again, it's not, that part is something that we see time and time again. So for whatever, and again, I actually think the way we portray it in the media is quite different, but actually being a member of a gang, I'm just gonna use that word broadly, crew, whatever, no matter what you do to it, it comes with all these horrible things. Your health gets worse, your chance of getting shot is incredibly higher, and in fact, even if you're not in a gang but hang around with other associates, like even if you're not doing anything, your risk is astronomically high. And so to your real question, the only way you get around that is by having a bit of human intelligence on it, and taking those things, being transparent about it. To go to the issue of legitimacy, I've been very vocal that I think one of the huge mistakes around the strategic subjects list is that it's been secret. That's actually just awful. So I don't have anything else to say. That's the absolutely wrong way to go about facilitating legitimacy. It should be public. I think if anybody's making $1 off that, that's immoral. I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know what that means. I just think that's awful as a human being to make $1 off that. But instead, I do think you can use that. And the parallel, of course, is, and then I'll stop. We do these sorts of human data intelligence with things like HIV infection, in which we work with very vulnerable populations, sex worker, men who have sex with men, people who share needles. These are people who are very vulnerable, and yet we do this, and it works, right? We can intervene in ways that are responsible, moral, and can have a very dramatic effect on people's lives. When you're talking about arrests, I think once you move from victim to offender, you start crossing all these constitutional lines, which I know nothing about, because I'm not a lawyer. I just know that they're there, and that when I made this comment about treating people as victims, if I go into the ER with a heart attack, thank God they wouldn't measure my BMI first. They shouldn't check my criminal record first either, right? They should save my life because it's valuable. And actually, I've never met anybody that's ever disagreed with that statement I just made, right? No matter what it is, you save this person's life because they're a human being, and all that other stuff is a different set of questions.
Lori, real quick.
Sure.
I agree. But I also think that we also have to have, Alderman Sawyer touched on it briefly in the morning session, we have to have honest conversations about who we're talking about as well.
Right.
Someone who gets a tattoo, I don't have any tattoos, I'm not in the tattoo world, but those of my friends and people I know who get tattoos, there's a commitment to getting that tattoo. So there's usually, if you get a gang tattoo, there's some level of commitment when you get that tattoo. Now, that commitment may change down the road. Certainly, if you're 13 or 15, it may change. But we can't negate that, and we can't not have an honest conversation about that and ignore it. Or I'm not saying that you did, but that's something that we need to really look at hard at times. The other thing is, and this is something that from the victim side of things, and Andrew did a great job touching on this, I may gangbang today, and I may gangbang for 10, 15 years of my life, and then I find Jesus, I open up 2 orphanages, so on and so forth. But the 3 people here that were my opposition have not forgotten that I killed their guys. And some people, they remember as very close to them. So it doesn't matter what my personal transformation is. I am still in that risk network because they aren't going to let it go simply because I made a transformation and a change in my life.
So we have time, I think, for 1-2 questions, maybe. Yes, Judge Hall.
The joys of being a judge.
That's right.
I wanted to pick up on human, because everybody seems to be talking about human beings. I think one of the things that Dr. Papachristos mentioned was that the line between physical and media has just blurred. Bullying can occur physically, it can occur on the media. Gangbanging can occur physically and on the media. So what's happening is we're dealing with the same thing, but the media just adds an intensity to it, a pervasiveness to it, never-endingness to it, and an urgency because of its consistent, forever reverberation of it. But it seems that the solution of how to address it has not changed. Media is just a tool, and it's all those things that we're talking about. So what I was hearing in terms of solutions from Chris, whom I've known him for a long time, was that it was the one-on-one human intervention of conversation with the people who were at risk, which was the most effective. That intervention is not going to come through a media contact or a tweet. It's going to come from somebody looking them in the eye and saying, I'm here, I'm listening, I want to help. And apparently that's been effective. You had responses. And Public Defender Campanelli was saying the same thing. How do we talk to people about bullying and gangbanging or whatever? We're talking to the kids and saying, here's the consequence of your conduct. So the conversation that we're having, yes, in the terribly urgent and inordinately complicated area of media, which is almost overwhelming in trying to respond to, it looks like the responses continue to be human ones. What kind of reaction do I have to that?
Agreed, 100%.
Agree, 100% also.
Amen, yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
amen.
well, I'd say there's an education piece, though, that's important to understand if you have, again, nieces or nephews, sons or daughters, or if you're a teacher trying to monitor what's going on with your students, is understanding the new language of social media. And so, yes, you need to understand that today's Friday, so it's hashtag FBF, Flashback Friday. You have to understand how they're using emojis. And so, I mean, we've kind of dumbed down language down to just hieroglyphics. So you need to understand that this emoji after this one means something different than in a different sequence. So part of that, yes, is an education piece for those who want to make, intervention possibilities. I love social media because it does give you this wide platform and instant access to information, which could then lead to that person-to-person contact. So I applaud Christopher for being involved and already being on his team's Twitter pages already to see what they're saying, and then deciphering what they're saying when they say it, because there's some very clever uses of terms out there. So that education is an important part.
Applaud my son.
The other thing I would add to that is it's also worth all of us understanding that a lot of the behaviors about social narcissism, those are actually just normal human behaviors. So go look at your Facebook posts, right? When I post pictures of my coffee, because I got crazy coffee pouring skills, like you see my beautiful cup of coffee, but I don't show you the shithole of my living room looks like, right? I show you the coffee because it looks beautiful and I'm proud of it, right? And you don't see the rest. And that's actually the way, it's actually bad for us, by the way, that we do that, because it makes you feel like that. Or I think there was a New York Times article that showed that most men, Katy Perry's and they're like #1 downloads, but they never say Katy Perry. They always say, oh, I'm listening to Common or something like that. But they don't admit to Katy Perry online, on Facebook. So there's a normal human behaviors involved in here. And we need to understand that too is something, when we make human content, we need to understand that that's what all of us do with our online personalities. There's a very human element that's translating over to these realms.
Lori, let's just do one more quick question, and then
Yes,
we got to
please.
stay on track.
Are threats made on the dark web and on the social media that disappears after you send it after 5 seconds? And if so, how do you monitor that?
Yeah, the answer is
Mr. Special
yes.
Agent?
You, Jeff, yeah. FBI Jeff.
Yeah, yes. So And this is part of the understanding of the technology and the way things have changed. So the text message that you used to be able to send through SMS, your simple messaging system, now people are turning towards Whisper and Secret and Yik Yak because there is this sense, again, exploiting human nature, that they don't want to take responsibility or have to face the consequences of what they say. So they're turning towards these apps that not only encrypt what they say, but then also kind of anonymize themselves. So if you have the Secret app, for example, since we're all in the same room here and if we were all connected on Secret, I could send a text saying, hey, man, I skipped work today. I went to the White Sox game. Feels so good, right? All of you would see in our circle that somebody said it, but it's not attributed to me, which differentiates itself from Facebook, where your name, I said it, Jeff Jones said it. So yes, that does happen. And on the dark web and some of the ugly places of the internet, yes, threats are indeed made. And there are lots of different kinds of real-world consequences for those actions where things are organized there. There's lots of open-source reports about ISIS using Telegram channels, and Telegram has designed itself to be as secretive as possible. And there are channels which are designed which have a person who monitors who can come into that area. The messages in there have a burn notice. They leave after a certain amount of time. And the idea is to be able to organize and do things, not have anyone else see it, and then the information, at least allegedly, disappear. So the answer is yes.
So I think our time is up. Thank our panel. Great discussion.